She didn't know that answering the door at 11 p.m. would be the last decision she'd make entirely on her own terms. Thea Calloway had been a nurse practitioner for 6 years, which meant she knew exactly what a man looked like when he was trying not to show pain. The one standing on her doorstep in the rain, dark suit soaked through, jaw set like concrete, bleeding through his shirt in a way that would have alarmed anyone who didn't spend their days elbow-deep in emergencies, was doing a terrible job of pretending he was fine. She should have closed the door. She had a 7-year-old asleep upstairs. She had a morning shift at the clinic in 8 hours. She had every reason in the world to tell this stranger to call 911 and step back inside. Instead, she said, "How bad is it?" His eyes met hers. Dark gray, sharp, the kind of eyes that cataloged everything and gave nothing back. Manageable, that's not what I asked. A pause. Rain drummed against the porch railing, through and through. Left side. She pulled the door open wider. "Get in before you ruin my floor." That was how Kieran Voss walked into her life. Soaking wet, bleeding, and completely in control, despite both of those things. She stitched him up at her kitchen table while he sat perfectly still and didn't make a sound, which told her more about who he was than anything he said in the hour that followed. He didn't explain himself. He asked questions instead. Quiet, methodical questions about her, how long she'd lived here, whether she lived alone, what her daughter's name was. She answered without meaning to, the way you do when someone asks with absolute certainty that you'll respond. It wasn't until he was standing at the door again, jacket back on, like none of it had happened, that she realized she'd told a stranger things she hadn't even told her closest friends. "Thank you," he said. "Don't come back," she said. He nodded once, like that was a reasonable request, and walked into the rain. He came back 3 days later, not bleeding this time, suit dry, expression unreadable, a plain white envelope in his hand that he held out to her without preamble. "What is this?" "A conversation you need to have." Inside was a single photograph. Her brother, Bennett, smiling in front of what looked like a casino in Macau, arm around a man Thea didn't recognize. On the back, in neat handwriting that wasn't hers and wasn't Bennett's, 2311 days. The number hit her like cold water. "Where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter where I got it." Kieran Voss leaned against the doorframe with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that patience was more effective than pressure. What matters is that your brother owes that money to people who will collect one way or another, and you're the only person left in his life with anything worth taking. Thea's chest went tight. She thought of Rosalie upstairs, still sleeping, clutching the worn rabbit she'd had since she was 2. She thought of the clinic, her car, the equity in this house she'd spent 4 years paying down. He wouldn't. He already has. Kieran's voice wasn't cruel about it, just factual, the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis. He used your name as collateral, your address, your daughter's school. The ground did something unpleasant beneath her feet. "You're lying." "I have no reason to lie to you." She looked at him, at the envelope, at the photograph of her brother grinning like he hadn't just sold her out for gambling money. Her hands were steady. Years of clinical training made her hands always steady, but the rest of her was not. "What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight. "I want to make a proposal. Sit down first. I'll stand." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, but close. "Fine. I represent certain interests that are owed that debt. I'm also in a position where I need something specific from you. A temporary arrangement. Public-facing. You would present as my partner for a period of time while I manage a business transition in this city." Thea stared at him. "You want me to pretend to date you. To be my fiancé, technically. For 4 months. That's insane. In exchange, the debt disappears entirely. Your brother walks free. Your daughter's name comes off every list it's currently on." The word lists landed in her stomach like a stone. What kind of lists? The kind you don't want her on. She should have thrown him out. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way she thought about all her options in an emergency, fast and clear, and without the luxury of panic. Throw him out. Call the police. Call Bennett and scream at him until her voice gave out. None of those options got her daughter off a list she hadn't known existed 20 minutes ago. "I have conditions," she said, Something moved behind his eyes. Of course you do. My daughter doesn't know anything real about this. As far as Rosalie is concerned, we met normally, we dated. This is a normal relationship. I won't let her get attached to something fake, agreed. I keep my job. My schedule is mine. I won't cancel shifts. I won't rearrange my life around yours without 48 hours notice. Reasonable, and you don't touch me. She held his gaze. This is a performance for whoever is watching, not for us. He looked at her for a long moment. You'll need to be convincing. I've worked 12-hour overnight shifts on 3 hours of sleep and convinced patients I was perfectly fine. I can be convincing. That wasn't a smile, exactly, but it was the closest thing to one she'd see from him for a long time. 4 months. Thea. That's all I'm asking. She hated that he already knew her name. She signed his contract at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd stitched him up, which felt like some kind of cosmic joke, while Rosalie slept upstairs and the clock above the stove ticked steadily toward midnight. What followed was the strangest 4 months of her life, and she'd had some genuinely strange ones. Kieran Voss existed at a scale she didn't. That was the only way she knew how to describe it. His apartment took up the top 2 floors of a building in the financial district that had its own security team, its own elevator code, its own set of protocols. She was walked through by a woman named Astrid, who delivered information the way a military briefing officer might, efficient, thorough, and with the clear implication that there would be a test. There were cars that appeared before she'd finished deciding to go somewhere. There were people whose entire job seemed to be anticipating what Kieran might need in the next 12 hours. And there was Kieran himself, who was somehow simultaneously everywhere and unknowable. She learned things about him the way you learn things about a city. Not all at once, but in small accumulations. He drank his coffee black and too hot. He read physical newspapers, 3 of them every morning, in a specific order. He was fluent in 4 languages and had opinions about all of them. He never raised his voice, which somehow made him more frightening than people who did, because you understood instinctively that if Kieran Voss needed to raise his voice, something had gone very wrong. He was also, in a way that she hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with, careful with Rosalie. Not performatively careful, not the way adults were sometimes careful with children they found inconvenient, tolerant, slightly stiff, counting down until they could hand the child back. Careful in a way that paid attention. He remembered that Rosalie didn't like the texture of mushrooms. He noticed, without being told, that she was afraid of dogs but too proud to admit it, and he made sure the dogs that sometimes appeared at events they attended were kept at a distance without ever making Rosalie feel singled out. He brought her a book once, a thick illustrated one about deep-sea creatures, because apparently he'd seen her pause at a documentary about bioluminescence on Thea's television and file it away. You didn't have to do that, Thea told him. I was passing the bookstore, he said, which was the kind of answer that answered nothing. She's not part of this arrangement, Kieran. He looked at her steadily. I'm aware. Then why? Because she's a child who deserves to be treated like one. He turned back to whatever he was reading. It's not complicated. It shouldn't have unsettled her. It did anyway. The social performances were easier than she'd expected, mostly because she was good at reading rooms, and Kieran was good at giving her enough context before they entered one that she never felt completely exposed. They developed a shorthand, a particular look when she needed to be rescued from a conversation, a slight shift in his posture, when he wanted her closer for the benefit of whoever was watching. She was a quick study. He told her that once, which, from him, landed somewhere between a compliment and a statement of fact. You seem surprised, she said. I'm not surprised. I'm reassessing. What were you expecting? He considered that. Someone who needed more direction. Sorry to disappoint. You haven't. He said it simply, without decoration, and went back to the conversation they'd been having with a shipping executive who'd been trying to get Kieran's attention all evening. She thought about that on the drive home. You haven't. The way he said it, like it cost him something to admit. 6 weeks in, she found out what the arrangement was actually about. Not from Kieran. From a woman named Margot at a charity gala, in a venue that had probably cost more to rent for an evening than Thea's annual salary. Margot was 60-something, impeccably maintained, and had the particular smile of someone who collected information and used it selectively. "He's never brought anyone to these things," Margot said pleasantly, touching Thea's arm. "Not in years. Since Isabel." Thea kept her expression neutral. "He doesn't talk about the past much." No, Margot's eyes were sharp. He wouldn't, especially not about her. She paused. "You know there are people who think what happened to Isabel wasn't an accident." "I'm sorry," but Margot had already turned to greet someone else, leaving those words hanging in the air like smoke. Thea found Astrid the next morning. Astrid, who had the expression of someone who'd been briefed that this conversation might happen and had prepared accordingly. "Isabel Voss," Thea said. "Tell me, that's not Astrid." A pause. "His wife. She died 4 years ago. It was ruled accidental. A car accident outside Monaco." Astrid's voice was careful. "Mr. Voss does not discuss it. Is that why he needs this? The arrangement? Someone is using her death against him somehow?" Astrid's silence was its own answer. She sat with that all day, carried it through her shift, through the careful mechanics of doing her job, while her brain ran a parallel track in the background. Rearranging pieces she hadn't known were connected. When she got home that evening, Kieran was in her kitchen. This had started happening sometime in the 3rd week. Him simply being there when she arrived, having let himself in with a key she'd handed over in a moment of practicality she occasionally regretted. Standing at the counter, reading something on his phone. "Isabel," she said. He went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of something that had been braced for impact. "Who told you? Does it matter?" He set his phone down. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "What do you want to know? Why didn't you tell me what this was actually about? What is it actually about? Someone is using her death to pressure you. That's why you need a visible, credible relationship to demonstrate that you're stable, established, moving forward. That whatever they're threatening to say about what happened to her can't stick because you clearly have nothing to hide." She watched his face. "Am I wrong?" He looked at her for a long time. "You're not wrong, so I'm your alibi. You're my..." He stopped, started again. "The people who are moving against my business interests have been feeding a narrative that I was responsible for what happened to Isabel, that her death wasn't an accident, that I orchestrated it." His voice was completely flat. "They're using it to destabilize my position, my partnerships, my reputation. A visible, serious relationship undermines the narrative. It suggests a man comfortable enough in his private life to move forward." "Were you?" Silence. "Responsible," she clarified, though she thought she already knew. She'd been watching him for 6 weeks. She knew what guilt looked like. She'd seen it on patients' families, on people sitting in hospital corridors at 3 a.m. She'd seen what it looked like on Kieran's face once or twice when he thought she wasn't paying attention, and it wasn't the guilt of having done something. It was the guilt of not having been able to stop it. "No," he said. Just that. One word with no defense attached to it, no elaboration, no attempt to convince her. Like the truth didn't need decoration. She believed him. She didn't know what to do with that either. "You should have told me from the beginning," she said. "Yes, I agreed to something without knowing what I was agreeing to. Yes, I want to renegotiate the contract." He blinked. She was fairly certain, the most surprised she'd seen him. "What? New terms? You tell me everything relevant from this point forward. Everything. If I'm walking into a room where someone might say something about Isabel, I know before I go in. If there's a specific narrative I'm supposed to be supporting, I know what it is. No more being managed." He looked at her as if he were genuinely encountering something new. "You want full information. I want to be a partner, not a prop. If you wanted a prop, you should have hired an actress." She held his gaze. "I'm guessing you didn't hire an actress, because what you actually need is someone who can think on their feet. So let me." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Rosalie was in the backyard, her voice audible through the screen door as she narrated something to herself the way she did when she was building something or conducting what she called investigations. "All right," Kieran said. "All right. New terms. Full information." He looked at her with something that she hadn't seen on his face before, something that might have been, underneath everything else, respect. You're right. You deserve to know. I did. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. She'd been prepared for a lot of responses. Not that one. An apology, plain and direct, with no qualification. It landed somewhere she hadn't expected. Okay, she said. Then start now. Tell me who Isabel was. Not the version I'd find in an article. The real one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down at her kitchen table, in the same chair, she realized, where she'd stitched him up in the rain, and he started talking. Isabel had been an architect. They'd met when she was redesigning a building he'd acquired, and he'd hired her for the project, mostly because she was the only person in the meeting who'd argued with his initial vision rather than agreeing with it. They'd been married for 3 years. She'd been brilliant and impatient and had a laugh that could fill a room. She died on a Tuesday in October on a road outside Monaco when her car went through a barrier, and the investigation had ruled it an accident, and Kieran had spent 2 years being absolutely certain it wasn't, and being unable to prove it. The people moving against you now, Thea said, they were involved. I believe so. Yes. And they're using the accusation against you to prevent you from going after them. Essentially, she thought about this. So this isn't just about your reputation. It's about getting close enough to someone who knows something. He looked at her carefully. You're very fast. I'm a nurse practitioner who spends her days diagnosing things people don't know how to describe. You get good at pattern recognition. She held his gaze. Who are we trying to get close to? For a moment, he just looked at her, this man she'd met in the rain 6 weeks ago, who bled quietly and asked questions that weren't questions and brought her daughter books about deep-sea creatures. And something shifted in his expression. Something that had been held in careful reserve started to loosen, just slightly, like a door opened a crack. A man named Galveston, he said. He's attending the Meridian Foundation Gala next month. He was Isabel's client before I was. He knew her. He knew her movements. He paused. He also has a particular weakness for earnest people. People who seem genuinely uncalculated. And you're not earnest. I'm not. She looked at him. I am, I know. His voice was quiet. That's why I came to your door. She should have been angry about that. She was a little bit angry about that. But underneath the anger was something else, something that she pressed down and refused to look at directly. Because they had a month to go and she had a daughter asleep upstairs, and she couldn't afford the confusion of caring about someone she'd agreed not to care about. She focused on the work instead. She was good at the gala, better than she'd expected, better probably than Kieran had expected, though he didn't say so. She found Galveston, late 50s, easy smile, the kind of charming that had been practiced so many times it looked effortless, and she let herself be exactly what she was. Direct, curious, unimpressed by the room in a way that people in these rooms almost never were. He was drawn to it immediately, the way people were drawn to anyone who didn't seem to want anything from them. She told him she was a nurse practitioner. He was intrigued. She asked him what he did, genuinely, and listened to the answer, and asked a follow-up question that demonstrated she'd actually been listening. And by the end of 20 minutes, she had his card and an invitation to a dinner he was hosting the following week. Across the room, she caught Kieran watching her. His expression was difficult to name. After, in the car, he said, "You enjoyed that? I enjoy talking to people. It's why I'm good at my job." She looked out the window. He knew her, Kieran. He talked about an architect he'd worked with years ago, didn't name her, but the timeline matches. He's carrying something about it. She felt him go still beside her. He's not the one who did it, she said, or he doesn't think he is, but he knows what happened. He might be willing to say so if someone asked him the right way. You think you can get him to say it. I think he's been waiting for someone to ask. She turned to look at Kieran. Sometimes people want to confess. They just need permission. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the city moved past, all lit glass and wet asphalt. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. "You could have just completed the arrangement. The debt is cleared regardless. You don't owe me this." She thought about how to answer that. Thought about the last 2 months. Rosalie's face when Kieran remembered small things. The photograph of her brother she still hadn't brought herself to throw away. The night 3 weeks ago, when Rosalie had had a nightmare and cried for 40 minutes, and Kieran had simply sat on the hallway floor outside her door and read aloud from the deep-sea creature book in a quiet, steady voice until Rosalie had fallen back asleep. "Because someone took something from you," she said finally, "and then they tried to use it to take more. And I spend every day giving people back pieces of themselves they thought were gone." She looked at him. This isn't that different. He didn't say anything, but his hand, resting on the seat between them, moved slightly, not toward her, just moved. Like something had shifted. She looked out the window and didn't say anything either. The dinner with Galveston was 10 days later. Thea asked her questions with the same uncalculated directness that had worked at the gala, and by the end of the evening, Galveston had said enough. About a business deal gone sideways, about someone who'd needed to be removed from a situation, about a road outside Monaco and a car that hadn't been serviced the way it should have been. That Thea was recording on her phone in her jacket pocket when he said it. She gave the recording to Kieran that night. He listened to it twice. She watched his face while he did. She'd learned to read him in the past 2 months, the small tells, the slight shifts, and what she saw when he listened to it the second time was not triumph. It was grief. Quiet, private grief, the kind that had been waiting a long time to have somewhere to go. She didn't say anything. She just sat there while he sat with it, the way she sometimes sat with patience in the difficult minutes after something had been confirmed. Present, not trying to fix it, just there. After a long time, he said, "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. It still has to go somewhere actionable. I know. I have people." He was quiet for a moment. "This is enough to start the right conversations." She nodded. She should have left it there. She'd been going to leave it there. But something about the way he was sitting, the specific quality of his stillness, which she'd come to understand, was different things at different times, and right now was the stillness of someone who had just set down something very heavy and wasn't quite sure what to do with their empty hands, made her stay. "She would have liked you," he said, not looking at her, looking at the table. "You don't have to. She would have. She had no patience for people who performed. You don't perform." Thea was quiet. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything from the beginning. I've been," he stopped, "accustomed to managing situations, not sharing them. I know. I'm aware that doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't." She looked at him, "But I understand it." He raised his eyes to hers. There was something in them that she'd been carefully not looking at for weeks, the way you don't look directly at something bright because you know it'll change what you can see after. "The 4 months are almost up," he said. "Yes. I don't want them to be." She'd known that was coming. Had known it for probably 3 weeks, in the way you know something before you let yourself know it, in the tilted quality of certain moments, in the way her own chest did things it had no business doing when he walked into a room. "Kieran, I'm not asking for an arrangement this time." His voice was even. "I'm asking if you'd like to have dinner with me. The 2 of us, not for anyone watching. Just because I'd like to have dinner with you." She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way she thought through her decisions, clearly, honestly, without hiding from what she actually wanted. She thought about Rosalie, who would adapt to anything, who was already more attached than Thea had allowed herself to notice. She thought about the clinic, her life, the careful architecture of a single mother who'd learned not to let too many variables in. And then she thought about a man who sat outside a child's door and read about deep-sea creatures until the crying stopped, and who said, "I'm sorry," without qualifications, and who had looked at her across a crowded room with an expression she was only now letting herself name. "Yes," she said, "but I'm choosing the restaurant." Something happened to his face, slow and real and entirely unguarded. "Of course you are, and you're meeting Rosalie first, properly, not as part of anything." She looked at him. This man she'd stitched up at her kitchen table in the rain, who bled quietly and sat with grief, and turned out, improbably, impossibly, to be someone she could trust, and made the choice. Clear-eyed, fully informed. Hers. "Okay," she said. "Then that's where we start." They did start there. The restaurant she chose was small and loud and not at all the kind of place he would have picked. And he ordered the wrong thing off the menu and she told him so. And he laughed, actually laughed, with his whole face. And she thought, there it is. That's who he is under all of it. Rosalie met him on a Saturday, a real meeting, at a farmer's market Thea went to every week, because Rosalie liked the woman who sold honey and the man who always had unusual fruit. Kieran had never been to a farmer's market. His expression when confronted with sample cups of artisanal jam was something Thea filed away to consider later. Rosalie, who had her mother's particular talent for reading rooms, watched him for about 20 minutes before she said, "You came to a lot of my mom's work things." "I did," Kieran said. "Did you like them?" "I liked that your mother was there." Rosalie considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old processing information she suspects is important. "Are you going to be around more now?" Kieran looked at Thea. Thea looked back at him. "That's up to your mom," he said. "Mom?" "Yeah," Thea said. "He's going to be around more." Rosalie accepted this the way she accepted most things. Quickly, completely, then moved on to more immediate concerns. "Do you know anything about honeybees?" she asked Kieran. "Because that lady is going to explain them to me, and sometimes she talks very fast." "I know a moderate amount about honeybees," Kieran said, and fell into step beside her daughter. Thea watched them walk toward the honey stand, Rosalie already talking, hands moving, Kieran listening with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered to him, and felt something settle in her chest, not the resolution of a problem. Something quieter than that. Something that didn't need to be analyzed or managed or protected against. The arrangement ended exactly 4 months and 2 days after it began. The debt was cleared. Her brother called her, once from somewhere she didn't recognize, and said thank you in a voice so small she barely recognized it as his. She said she loved him and meant it, and also meant she didn't know yet whether she'd forgiven him, and that was okay. Forgiveness, in her experience, was rarely instant. Galveston's recording went to people who knew what to do with it. What followed was slow and not always clean, because these things never were, but it moved. The narrative against Kieran stopped having anywhere to land. The people who'd built it found that their foundations were less stable than they'd thought. Isabel didn't come back, because nothing brought people back. But the truth about what happened to her went somewhere. That was something. It was, Thea thought, the most real kind of justice she'd seen, not perfect, not total, but real, forward-facing, built from what was left. 2 years later, Thea stood in the kitchen of an apartment that had started out as Kieran's, and now felt, in all the small specific ways that mattered, like theirs. Rosalie was at the table doing homework that she kept insisting wasn't that hard, while very clearly finding it hard. Kieran was beside her, not doing it for her, just present, available, occasionally asked to spell something or confirm a fact about the American Revolution. Thea watched them and thought about the girl who'd opened her door in the rain because she could see a man was hurt and couldn't make herself not help. She hadn't known what she was letting in. She hadn't known it would be this, the ordinary weight of it, the dailiness, the way a life got built not out of grand gestures, but out of farmers' markets and wrong menu choices and reading aloud outside a child's door at midnight and learning slowly how to share something as guarded as yourself with someone who knew how to be careful with it. "Mom," Rosalie said without looking up. "How do you spell significance?" "Significance," Thea said. Kieran said it at exactly the same time. Rosalie looked between them. "That's kind of weird." "Is it?" Thea asked. "A little." Rosalie went back to her paper. "But okay, weird." Thea met Kieran's eyes across the kitchen. He looked back at her, gray eyes steady, that particular expression she'd learned to read as the unguarded version of him, the one that existed only in these small domestic moments, and what she saw in them was the same thing she'd been feeling since a Saturday at a farmer's market when she'd watched him fall into step beside her daughter, without making it mean anything more than it was. Home. Strange, earned, chosen. Theirs. She reached across the counter and took his hand, and he turned his palm up without looking away from her, and that was enough. That had always been the kind of love worth having, not the kind that swept you off your feet, but the kind that made sure you had ground beneath them.